Tom Griffiths. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for a productive conversation.
Hi there. Thanks for having me here.
So first off, and we had a brief discussion before we jumped on. This book is deep. But what I love is that it inspires a lot of thinking throughout. It's not a book that, and I love books like this where it's not one that you can just tear through. You're literally like, and what I also appreciated about it as I was going through it is just some of the things that I either thought about this that I think I'm kind of right on, but also opening my mind up to different things. One of the first things I noticed right out of the gate was, in the introduction, one of the when you're talking about the mathematical models and cognition took, models of cognition that took the insights of logic and applied them to a wide range of cognitive problems. And the first one that you put there was reasoning. I've always thought, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, that reason is kind of like the nuanced middle between logic and emotion. So this idea of reason kind of dances between those. And I know we're gonna obviously dive into deep aspects of the book, but when I'm coming across stuff like this, I'm like, I want to talk to somebody who's studied this stuff and understand if I've even got that a bit right when it comes to this, or am I on the right track? So, I mean, we're going to get into where logic maybe doesn't necessarily hold, and you've got some stuff in the book where like, hey, you can't just rely on logic, which led me to that question. So when it comes to reason and reasoning in the ideas of thought, does it live somewhere in between logic and emotion? Is it that simple?
When psychologists talk about reasoning, they normally mean something which is a little closer to logic than to emotion. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to, describe that whole spectrum in a way that's a little more mathematically precise than you might intuitively think. And so I have plenty of colleagues who are interested in things like computational psychiatry, right? Where they're interested in how do we use the kinds of mathematical approaches I talk about in the book and then extend those to engage with, like things like emotion as well as ways of thinking about psychiatric interventions and so on.
Good. So I've always thought that it kind of is definitely more towards logic, but it's not pure logic. When we talk about logic in that purest sense, and I know that there's I'm going to, again, I've got my book dog-eared like crazy in here, but when we talk about logic, I think one of the things that I noticed again was this idea that, here we go, let's find it here. And again, jumping all over. That's how when we have these conversations, I'm not going to go sequentially through the book. So in The Limits of Logic, which is chapter 5, logic is a powerful, beautiful tool for solving a wide range of problems, but those problems need to have a particular structure. So, and you've even said like not every problem has this structure. So do you find that when people are approaching, whether it's work life, personal life, and they're trying to look at logic, how do you help someone, or how do you help someone understand that, hey, this may not be purely solvable by logic, because, and I think that the reason, my belief is that we'd love it to be purely logic because it just makes it so, again, simple, concrete, absolute. This is where the nuance comes in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So logic is the ideal tool for solving problems where you've got all the information that you need, and then the answer is certain based on that information, right? So it's a way to go from things that you know to be true to other things that it's reasonable to conclude are true. Almost no situation in human lives has that structure, right? So when you're solving a math problem, it's kind of like that. There are sort of, logic problems and so on that have that kind of structure. Occasionally you have something where you're trying to satisfy a bunch of constraints. It's just a matter of working out what the way to do that is. But a lot of the problems that we solve as humans involve uncertainty. You might not have all the information that you need in order to determine the conclusion. You might have to make a guess, or you might have. It might even be a problem where it's not even like there's a right and a wrong answer. There's just much more fuzziness about it. And those were things that meant that even though cognitive science, our sort of approach to thinking about mathematical models of the mind, had started out with logic, after a couple of decades of trying to like fit all of cognition into those strictures of logic, it kind of became clear that it wasn't going to be able to do the job.
When your previous book, Algorithms to Live By, right? That was the one that I look at that book in the context of your body of work when it comes to writing, and then the laws of thought. Does this seem, to me, I'm wondering, is it did you have to write that book to get to this one, or was it almost like, oh, maybe this book should have come before it, so that way when people are thinking about algorithms, that they at least have a blueprint to go by? I'd love to hear your thoughts and your insights on that.
Yeah, so that's actually a nice observation. So yeah, this is the book that I originally wanted to write, but realized that I didn't have the chops to write as the first book, right? So one of the nice things about Algorithms to Live By was that I got to collaborate on that with my friend Brian Christian, who had previously written nonfiction books, and really was a chance to have a bit of an apprenticeship, because, as you said, this book is pretty deep, right? Like the book covers a couple, like 300 years worth of history. It's based on not just describing ideas, but telling the stories of the people who came up with those ideas and using those stories to hopefully make the ideas a little more intuitive. And that was a toolbox that I had to put together in order to be able to get to this point. So yes, you're right that there's a way in which this is a precursor to algorithms, and that algorithms has a little more of a nuanced view of, it sort of draws on a lot of these ideas and sort of, moves them forward in terms of thinking about how to apply them to your life. And this is really more about the foundations.
Well, one thing I will say is that you did I've read plenty of nonfiction books, and you've done the blend of anecdotal and empirical quite well with this, because there's a lot of, I think you need to add those stories to kind of obviously humanize it to a degree, especially when you've got a lot of academic research behind this. But also, if there's too much of that, then you see repeated, anecdotes because you can pull things from, a good example, you talk about Tversky in here. Let me see if I can find that, because Amos Tversky famously collaborated, like you were talking about collaboration, with Daniel Kahneman, right? And one of the things that I found interesting, which I did not realize, and let me just jump to that section here, was that he didn't always, there was some area of similarity that he focused on, not just decision making. And I think a lot of folks that are listening to this podcast or watching this live stream right now would be familiar with Tversky's work around like thinking fast and like all of that stuff, right? The work with Kahneman. And what's the book that Michael Lewis wrote where we talked about their relationship? I don't know if you've read it, but there's actually the Undoing Project. Yes. Yeah. Fascinating. Two very different people with similar interests, and similarity is one of those things that Tversky taught. Can you talk about his research and the similarity aspect? Maybe what led him, or what you might feel led him to the work that he did with Kahneman, but also, again, speaking of precursors to what you did, hey, this is the book that I wrote, and now this is the new one. Again, that progression just seems to be linked somehow.
Yeah. So I think, as you said, a lot of people know Tversky's work from his collaboration with Daniel Kahneman on what was called the heuristics-and-biases research program, right? And that's what's summarized in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And that's the idea that rather than following the sort of prescriptions of rational decision theory, we end up following some simple heuristics that result in biases in our behavior. And that work is very much consistent with earlier work that Tversky had done. And his earlier work was exploring, this question of similarity. Like, what is it that we mean when we say that two things are similar to one another? And what unites them is the approach that he took to engaging with those problems. So Tversky was trained as a mathematical psychologist. What's a mathematical psychologist? I'm a mathematical psychologist. It's somebody who uses math to try and understand how minds work. And the particular approach that he'd learned was what's called the axiomatic approach. And so if you remember from geometry class, axioms are like the rules that describe a mathematical domain, right? So like what are points and what are lines and these other kinds of things, right? And so he would say, if we want to mathematically describe some part of the mind, what we do is we write down those axioms, and that tells us about a mathematical system, and then we're going to show that mathematical system fits or doesn't fit with human behavior. And so his work on similarity was pushing back on the idea that one axiomatic system, the idea of space and geometry, was not going to do a good job of characterizing similarity.
Right.
So other people had asserted, maybe you could think about the similarity between two things as being like they're sort of close together in some conceptual space. And if you do that, that implies that similarity should follow the metric axioms. Like, similarity should be symmetric. If you travel from Princeton to Boston, you've traveled the same distance as if you travel from Boston to Princeton, right? So it's,
Yep.
spatial representations follow certain kinds of constraints. And Tversky showed that that was not the case. People are more willing to think that a horse is, that a camel is like a horse than that a horse is like a camel. So there's an asymmetry in the way that people perceive similarity. And so he then argued for an alternative view of similarity. So that's directly related to the work that he did with Kahneman, because what he was doing with Kahneman was in the same way taking the axioms of probability and decision theory and showing that people violated those axioms, right? So same thing, you sort of come up with a counterexample, you show that people, don't follow some fundamental rule of probability theory, and then you say, okay, that mathematical system is not a good description for what people are doing.
That dovetails nicely into the idea of what I found the core element to be going through the book: language. You just mentioned axioms in the mathematical sense, but there's other definitions for axioms too, right? Like a maxim widely accepted on its intrinsic merit, right? So again, that's very nuanced and human because again, it involves subjectivity. That seemed to be throughout the book, the idea of language being such an important distinction. In fact, one of the things I highlighted, again, as somebody who looks for the word productivity immediately based on the work that I do, was the idea of, and I think I again, dovetailing it here, productivity, you talk about phase structure, systems of rules can be to explain productivity, hierarchy, and compositionality. And productivity, in the sense of what I normally talk about, is obviously the idea of, the activity or quality to produce, especially in abundance. However, my belief around productivity, I believe that version of productivity is essentially broken because we've focused on the idea of let's make quantity, and quality kind of takes a back seat, kind of like Pirsig's work in Zen and his other, basically his life's work. For me, that idea of productiveness, the state of it is to me what humans can apply to it. So when I look at this and this idea of mathematical theory, and you're talking about mathematical psychology, it's like productivity as in the sense of what you talk about in the book. I'd love to hear what that is, that definition, versus what maybe somebody listening right now thinks, oh, Mike, what productivity is this? Nah, just like an axiom isn't always what that is, language is so important.
Yeah, so it is, I think, another sense of that word. But when a cognitive scientist or computer scientist talks about a system being productive, what we mean is that that system is able to produce new things that go beyond what you might expect, right? And so this was a challenge for explaining language. One of the strange properties of human languages are that it's possible for anyone to produce and consequently to hear a sentence that has never been said before. So I just did one, right? That sentence, probably one that's never been said exactly like that before. And, probably the first time you've heard exactly that sentence. That's what we mean when we talk about productivity in language. It's that you need to have, to characterize what language is, you need to define a system that makes it possible to produce more and more new things. And so that interlaces with modern generative AI, right?
Right.
Like that's a property that we look at when we look at an AI system, is whether it's really able to just, produce this sort of infinitude of novel things.
It's great that we're getting into AI because to me, this seems to be like the intersection, right? Between what we're talking about in terms of mathematical theory, humans, and where AI fits in. You bring up several examples of and again, when this research was happening, how would you say AI and generative AI has changed or advanced during your time, from when you started to work on this book to release date? Because it's been moving at a breakneck pace, possibly whiplash breakneck pace to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, so it was interesting because when I started the book, I normally, when I teach a class in cognitive science, I tell my students, this isn't going to be like taking a class in physics where you're going to learn the answers, right? In cognitive science, we spend a lot of time coming up with better versions of the questions that we're going to ask and sort of understanding those with precision. But we don't have like an answer that everybody agrees on. But I do think the one thing that's changed as a consequence of those advances in AI is that there's a kind of picture that we can have of what are some of the ingredients that we need for an intelligent system and how they fit together in a way that we didn't have previously. And so I think that's very exciting if you're a cognitive scientist. And that's something that changed just in the period that I was working on the book.
Tim has a question. If a productive system is one that produces new things, then really when we are talking about productivity, are we talking about creativity or creating? I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of characterizing what it is that cognitive scientists are talking about when they're talking about productivity. Yeah, it's a little more like, creativity. I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
So my daughter, she's going to Concordia, and she was talking about she's getting her bachelor's in psychology, and it's great because we can have conversations when she comes home, and she's like, she saw some of the books, and she goes, "Why do you have this book, Dad?" I'm like, because when we talk about people who think they can manage time, even though time is beyond us, I need to kind of tap into some of the things that make people think that can happen and what they can manage instead. So, but what she brought up, and again, this sentence has been said by her before, but I'll probably butcher it. It may not even be totally accurate, but you bring up Aristotle and Plato and stuff like that. She said, philosophy essentially is the precursor to psychology in a lot of ways, right? Which, again, I have no formal training in it. We're paying for her to go to school to get the training in it. So how important is it for people? Because I think people, when they're looking at, again, I want facts. I want this. I don't want, like, fuzziness is not, when you hear something like, well, when Aristotle talked about this or Plato talked about this, or even the Stoics, right? When we get back to that, we talk about that stuff. That story-driven human component versus, again, when we get into this mathematical kind of, mathematical theory, why is it important for people to either to understand that it's not just zeros and ones, for lack of a better term, and there's more to it than that?
Okay. All right. So there's a lot of things that got crammed in there. So all right. So the first one, philosophy being the precursor to psychology. I think philosophy is the precursor to every science. I think the thing that's unusual about psychology is that it's a science that really only got going in the last maybe 150 years, maybe a little bit less than that. And part of that is that the subject matter of psychology is just harder than other sciences because you want to study a thing that you can't see or touch, right? Like every other science has some way to at least, see the thing that they're studying, or maybe even a way to intervene on it, right? So,
Right.
If you're studying tiny atoms or distant galaxies, you have microscopes and telescopes to help you do that. You can't see a thought or touch a feeling, right?
Right.
So that meant that psychology really had a methodological challenge in how it was going to do what it was going to do. And that methodological challenge ran through at least the first half of the 20th century. And math turns out to be part of the solution to that challenge because it gives us a tool for making precise hypotheses about how thoughts and even feelings work.
Right.
That you can test out by looking at people's behavior and so on. And so that was the important ingredient that we had. And then in terms of zeros and ones, then, I think what we've seen is the evolution of the kinds of mathematical systems people use for describing minds, from something that's quite rigid, like logic, through to, something like probability theory, which is much more flexible and allows for uncertainty and, things that are between 0 and 1. And then things like artificial neural networks as a theory of how it is that you can create systems that are able to, approximate the ideals that are set for us by logic and probability theory.
Back to language for a minute, and actually more the limits of logic. Hume's riddle. We were talking about habits. Like habits, to me, again, when you talk about Tversky and Kahneman, the idea of similarity. I think the patterns, I think, are really, really important. Habit formation has patterns associated with it. And there's, again, whether you read James Clear's Atomic Habits or Charles Duhigg's work or BJ Fogg's work, like all of these things kind of like they say similar things differently, right? Again, there's a great example of how do you get the message across to somebody? We meet them where they're at, right? Can you talk about Hume's riddle? Because when I was looking at it, I'm like, this is fascinating to me. I had not heard about it before. Can you go into that a little bit and its role in kind of the work that you've put together for this book.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about logic, right? And logic helps you go from things that are certain, to other things that are certain. But that is not every kind of reasoning that we do as humans. There's another kind of reasoning that we do, which is more like things have happened in the past like this. So it's reasonable to conclude that they're going to be like that in the future, right?
Right.
And this is something that we call, it's a form of inductive inference where we don't have certainty about that conclusion that it's going to be like that in the future, but it seems pretty probable, right? The sun came up every day until now, so it's probably going to come up tomorrow, right? There's a lot of stuff that we do in our lives that's sort of founded on this principle that things are, going to be, tomorrow is going to be kind of like, yesterday, right?
Yeah.
And so David Hume was a philosopher who really wanted to see if you could justify that, right? There was a sort of project in philosophy of like, can you put these inductive inferences on the same solid grounding that we have for our deductive inferences, where they're characterized by logic? And his conclusion was basically, no, you're not going to be able to do that. So, and his argument was that in order to justify, these sorts of inferences, you're making an implicit assumption that the future is going to be like the past. And the only way that you could justify the assumption that the future is like the past is that, in the past, the future has always been like the past, right?
Yeah.
Like, today's relationship to yesterday is the same as tomorrow's relationship to today. And for all of the yesterdays in the past, the tomorrows were always, were always the way that we expected them to be. And so he says, you end up.
And let's not even get into just pretending that the past just happened now and now and now, and the future is ahead and ahead, right? Like, so there's all of that to take into account too, right?
Yeah. So his argument is that you end up justifying induction via induction, and that's no good. That's not a real justification. And so, his conclusion is that our tendency to engage in those kinds of inferences is a habit, right? It's kind of just like a learned pattern that has been pretty successful for us, and it's worked out okay so far.
And I would argue, or at least suppose, that a routine or ritual is just habits like these stacked upon one another to create yet another familiar pattern. We love patterns, don't we? I think that the first thing I thought when I saw your book was that this will help with things like, and you bring it up, categorization, like things that show people where patterns are. And one of the things that I think it's so odd to me, and it's probably because, again, I've spent my time in this, just like, imagining when you look at something like, why would we do it this way when I know that this way would be probably more beneficial? When I look at someone who put like a to-do list together, and then they have like, let's say they do a brain dump, they get everything out of their head and they put it in a sequential order. That's where they stop. They don't look, that's the way we build lists, and I'm going to go through it in this order. Oh, wait, I can't do this right now, so I'm going to skip down to here. So there's a lot of jumping instead of taking that moment, that space, that to categorize, to create markers, to identify. Is that how we get closer to, quote, this math that these algorithms that we can build for ourselves? Say, hey, listen, we shouldn't stop here, because the pattern or the thing I recognize is this day isn't going to operate like this. My brain does not operate in the sequence that it drops things out of my head. Because that's the biggest struggle that I find, and I think a lot of people, when they are exploring this stuff, is they stop at, I've made the list, or the dates tell me when to do it, so therefore the dates are God, for lack of a better term, instead of looking at things through maybe a different lens.
Yeah, one of the basic questions that psychologists have tried to answer is how we do things like form those categories, right? And it seems clear that even though we think about categories as being kind of rule-like, right? You sort of have this intuitive idea that there's some kind of definition in your head that, corresponds to whatever the thing is that you're trying to think about. Pretty much every category has fuzzy boundaries in a way that presents a challenge for that kind of view. And so acknowledging some of that fuzziness is actually perhaps useful in the way that you think about things. Like if you go into the world expecting that you're going to find clear-cut boundaries, you're going to get caught on the things that are the fuzzy boundaries that are actually sort of intrinsically there.
So when it all boils down to it, I want to get into the AI conversation because this intersection I think is really important. Do you think, because there's a lot of fear around AI, right? There's also a lot of abject, I'm just going to go all in whole hog and just use it for so many different things and not really have, again, that space, that thought around where this fits in. Where do you feel, first off, where do you feel AI fits into the equation so that we don't lose that quality element that humans can apply? Because, I mean, I've been using different AI models and you've pointed out at points of the book, it doesn't get this right 100% of the time. And the thing is, I don't think it ever will. But humans don't get it right 100% of the time either, which makes total sense. So first off, like, where does that fit in? And then if someone was trying to use, like, say, an AI tool to help them with this kind of, because I think that's where I think that's where it can fit in, is it can act as a bridge or it can act as again, a tool to assist where we might face friction. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because, I mean, you study this stuff and a lot of the things we're hearing about AI are either A, doom and gloom, B, hustle, do this, get it to automate everything in your life, all that stuff. And there's got to be a middle nuanced way, I would imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a more nuanced view, which comes from just thinking about intelligence in a slightly broader way. So I think one of the challenges that we have in thinking about AI is using our human model for how intelligence works and applying that to AI systems. And so that creates a lot of hype and anxiety because, if you had a human friend who was able to solve international math Olympiad problems at a gold medal level, that human friend would be really smart and competent and probably able to do all of the things that you can do as well, right? And so when you hear AI system solves these math problems, you're like, okay, that's it. It's over. Humans are not the smartest things on the planet anymore. We're done, right? And that's not the reality because the way that those AI systems are created, they are finding solutions that are quite different from the kinds of solutions that humans find, even though they're producing similar kinds of behavior. The way that they're producing that behavior is different from us. And as a consequence, the way that they sort of generalize from one problem to another is much more sort of patchy, right? So you get what's called jagged intelligence, where they can solve one problem really well, and then a problem that's right next to it, they're not so good at, and they sort of fail mysteriously. And I think we've all had that experience of like, just something, it seems really smart, and then just something weird happens, right?
Yeah.
And so that's because these are really systems that are starting out from a pretty sort of blank slate, being trained on a massive amount of human data that has weird amounts of different kinds of things in it. And, the problem that they're solving is a very kind of odd problem. It's basically like if you imagine being an alien in a distant galaxy and then receiving a radio signal from Earth and then trying to figure out everything about the humans on Earth from that radio signal, right? That is what the AI system is doing. Right. It's just sort of getting text and then learning to make predictions about text. And so making inferences about us from that. And so it's found some way of doing that, but the solution that it finds is quite different from the one that, human brains find. And so as a consequence, the intuitions that we have about people are not that useful and get us into trouble in some of these different ways.
When you're writing the book, I mean, you've got these laws of thought. You study this stuff, but what surprised you? What did you kind of learn that maybe you didn't expect, that kind of either it could have thrown you for a loop or gave you that like that epiphany kind of moment? Did anything like that happen as you went through it?
I mean, there's like stuff from the research that I did in the book and then stuff that was happening in the world, right? So the stuff that's happening in the world, I think, things like large language models were a surprise to everyone, but also in particular to cognitive scientists in demonstrating that language itself is a very powerful substrate for intelligence. And I think no one had quite realized that to the extent that those models demonstrate. And so I think that was an important sort of change in the way that we think about things. And then in terms of doing the research, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was just finding out that the roots of all of these kinds of things just go back far deeper than I'd expected. And so, reading, some of the first neural networks that could learn from data were created by a psychologist named Frank Rosenblatt in the 1950s. And going back and reading some of his papers, and he wrote this big book that came out in the early 1960s, and reading through that book, a lot of the things that we see in modern AI systems are there in the 1960s in the book, right? Like he'd sort of like
Yeah.
figured out one of the tricks. He'd even, you know, so the algorithm that's used to train these big AI models is called backpropagation. And he even had an algorithm that had that same
Wow.
name because that name was then read by the people in the 1980s who developed that algorithm in that book. So I could sort of like discover this intellectual lineage where David Rumelhat, who came up with that algorithm in the 1980s, had read Rosenblatt from the 1960s. And I think there's like relatively few people who had actually read that stuff. But once you read it, you can see the threads that go all the way through.
Yeah, that leads me to a question I did not expect to ask, but I think it's an important one because we see a lot of books come out. Like, I mean, I want people to pick up this book because there's a lot in here. Plus, you'll discover things that you didn't necessarily that you've read that. No, but I mean, I've read like a good example. Like I was talking to somebody yesterday or a couple days ago about the theory of constraints from the book The Goal, right? Which is from the late '80s, early '90s at the very least. But he was doing it before that. And there are people like, I've never heard of that before. But yet, like, there's so many things that, I mean, we've discussed here in my own community. Arnold Bennett's book, How to Live on 24 Hours a Day, which is a 110-year-old book that I found from Cal Newport, who I read. And I'm reading going, yeah, this applies now. Like, it's just some of the behaviors are the same, but the implementations, like instead of people, scrolling, they were reading the paper, or they thought, well, the day was the 9 to 5 and not the entire 24 hours. Like all of these things are, we've quote learned, or we have these from before. How important is it for us to not just look at the new sexy? I know you're trying to sell books here, so I want people to buy your book and not go back. Let me find that book that Tom was talking about. But I think these are really important things that we should be looking at, not just the new stuff, but I mean, Alvin Toffler talked about overchoice back in we face that today. Like there's so many of these things. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because I think that there's lessons to be learned there that we're missing out on.
Yeah. So part of the reason why I wanted to write this book in a way that would be accessible to a broad audience was because these are things that cognitive scientists have talked about for, a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
That are suddenly relevant to everybody, right? Because we're trying to figure out how to live in this world that has AI in it, right? And all sorts of questions about like, what are the limits of math for describing how minds work? And what are the kinds of approaches that work and don't? And what are the things that go wrong and so on come up? And having, in particular, a historical perspective on those things is helpful because you can see the moments from the past that rhyme with the present, right? You can kind of see, here's the thing that they tried and then that didn't work. And so maybe that's going to be a problem for our current AI systems too. And then here's the thing that was the solution to that problem. And so maybe that's going to be more important in the future as well. And so it gives you a kind of set of, recognizable strategies that you could use for trying to make sense of the current moment. The other thing is, for my students, what I say to them is, yes, you should be reading the latest AI machine learning papers, but you should also be reading these old books. And the reason is that what the old books have in them is really good questions, right? And good problems, right? So what you can get from reading the latest papers, you can find out how somebody solved a problem. But if you want to sort of, be able to figure out, well, what's the next problem that we have to solve? Going back to those things from the past is helpful because they often didn't know how to solve their problems or had some partial solution, but they were able to set up really important problems for us to think about.
So I want to add this from Paula. She said, I enjoyed Algorithms to Live By, and I'm not a math nerd. So Paul, you'll enjoy this because, there, again, it's, the interesting thing about this, because I read lots of Robert Greene's books too. They're deep, but this is not as long as a Robert Greene book. So let's be clear about some of the length of it. One thing that I think is also really important about, and we talked about this off the top, is like, unlike say Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, which is an old, like his wife had to rewrite it because his language was just so, he couldn't connect with the quote average layperson reader. You've got some stuff. I mean, yes, there's some stuff in here that you've got to, okay, let me put my deep thinking hat on. But those stories that you bring up, they kind of, again, that brings it in. It's like when we read books like The Alchemist or any of these sort of allegorical or fables type books that aim to teach us something. Of those stories that you talk about, were there any that you found that said this nails the point I'm trying to make in a way that the person that is not like Paula, not a math nerd, will be able to go, this will land. Like this will absolutely land.
Yeah. So I also wrote the book for people who are not math nerds, but are now living in a world where you have to know a little bit about what these systems are doing. So um, my target in the book was if you've taken like middle school math classes, it's going to be fine. So like you have to be comfortable multiplying and adding numbers together, and then there's no actual, you know, like it's anything that looked kind of like algebra. I tried to just turn into words, so you can actually just read the equation as words. And I read the audiobook, so I got to read out.
Wow, there's got to be some accompanying materials for the audiobook, right? Like
there are some for some parts of it, but all the equations I just read out, and I think it works okay. So it's designed to be as accessible as possible. And then in terms of those stories, I mean, the stories that I think resonate for people are some of these things where there are these crazy connections that occur through time. Like, so when we talked about logic, George Boole was the person who really came up with the first sort of system for mathematical logic that worked. He wrote this book called An Investigation of the Laws of Thought. That title is obviously echoed by my title here.
It's actually right, like at the very beginning of the book. It's the first thing you read.
And he's really the person who sort of kicked off this enterprise. But then there's a funny moment that happens, a couple hundred years later, where we have his great grandson Jeff Hinton played an important role in developing the learning algorithm that then makes it possible to create these big neural networks that underlie modern AI. And so you have this sort of like multi-generational continuity between the origins and then the sort of current state of the field in a way that is, almost, a wonderful sort of historical coincidence.
That's fascinating. The book is called The Laws of Thought, The Quest for a Mathematical Theory of the Mind. We touched on quite a bit of the stuff in it, but this is a book you've got to read. And it's one that, again, will sit, you want to take your time with it. Because, I mean, to me, this is once you can start to understand some of this stuff, I think to me, I think that it will help you operate, not just in work, but in life, because you'll start to think about things a little bit differently because you'll have that understanding. Tom, where can people pick up the book and keep up with the work that you're doing?
Anywhere you buy books, they're going to have those books. You can find me. I have a LinkedIn page. My lab is on Twitter and Blue Sky and so on. And there's more information about my work on my webpage at Princeton.
Excellent. And thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thank you.